All right, hey everybody. I'm excited for another stream. Today I'm excited to have Corey Miller. He is the president of Ratio Christi. And so I've been working under him for the past 6 years about. And it's been a really cool thing to just see all of the ways that he's got an influence and just a pulse on culture, and especially the way schools are moving, not only just in the secular world but even in Christian schools. I'm seeing some ways that, as I've been involved with that a bit myself, just seeing my brother go to a seminary school, realizing more and more where we've thought even sending your students to a Christian school is probably at least a safe move, and realizing there's some ways that that actually could be even maybe a more dangerous or risky move than even sending your kids to a secular school. So we'll talk about that and a number of other things. With that, Corey, thanks for joining us. I know you were,
Here.
yeah, you were a little bit unable to get into your normal office, and so we don't have the best video quality for you today, but that's all right. We can hear you fine, and I think that's the more important thing. So,
Very good. Good to be here with you, Noah.
yeah, for sure. So I wanted to start off. Your story is kind of an interesting thing, even as we talk about. We had Aaron Marshall on the show a couple of weeks ago talking about the Utah trip, and I think that missions trip in some ways is a little bit birthed because of your background with Mormonism yourself, and just realizing that's a group of people you want to see Ratio Christi really reach out to. So could you share a little bit with us of what that was like, and what how that plays into your journey and experience?
Sure. So I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah as a seventh generation Mormon. My ancestor was one of Joseph Smith's bodyguards. For those who don't know, Joseph Smith was the founder and the prophet of Mormonism. And that was my background for 7 generations. Had a friend that contacted me and wanted me to come spend the summer with him in California. And I said, okay, that'd be great. But he said, my dad says you got to go to this Christian camp. So I said, oh, okay, that can't be too bad. I went there for 1 week. The guy spoke on hell at the camp, and I tell people it scared the hell out of me and had an into me. It changed my world utterly. I came to know Jesus of the Bible, and that wasn't the same Jesus. The concept of grace wasn't the same concept of grace that I had grown up in Utah. And when I continued down that path and I started being challenged by some of my Mormon relatives and friends that I was an apostate, I was one who knew the truth and left it, that maybe I better reconsider because bad things are in store for me if I get this wrong. And so I needed to read the Book of Mormon again and pray for the sake of truth this time and not just tradition. And when I did, I found that I was just utterly shocked that I would have believed such a thing as Mormonism. And I came to conclude for a variety of reasons that I was glad that I left it. But now it made me start wondering, how do I know that the Bible, which we had always said that it was, true as far as it's translated correctly. We believe the Bible is the Word of God as far as it's translated correctly in Mormonism, which means it's not translated correctly, but that's okay. We had a living prophet and a living priesthood, and we could make do with that. But now that I no longer believe that, how do I know that the Bible was true? How do I know that it was historically reliable? How do I know that God even exists, and if so, which God? And that's what sent me onto this trajectory of comparative religions and philosophy, and eventually went down a road where I got some academic degrees in biblical studies and theology and pastored for a while, and then made a shift to philosophy, going off to the secular universities. I got some other academic degrees that way, taught for a while at secular universities, and then the opportunity came up to work with Ratio Christi, which I've now been doing for about 7 years.
Okay, awesome. Um, so yeah, now you've been the president, CEO. I think is the title we really give it, for Ratio Christi for the past 7 years. What what is it about Ratio Christi that you think is so important to what we bring to the table compared to other ministries?
Well, I love the fact that Ratio Christi is interested in pursuing truth. That was something that resonated with my heart coming out of Mormonism. I love that they're able to, and this is true for everybody in the organization, that we're able to honestly consider various viewpoints, various different religions, points on science, philosophical issues, and we can jump into controversy, and yet we try to generate more light than heat in the process. And so, we talk about eternal things. We talk about important things that really are the difference makers in life. Is there meaning to life? Are there objective moral truths? Can we know if God exists? And can we know God? So I'm really excited about that. I'm excited that Ratio Christi loves to engage in the hot topics, and that even means legally that we're willing to stand up and appeal for our, as Paul would say in the New Testament, our Roman citizenship, in this case for our American rights. That was a country founded with a Christian background, and all the universities the same way. And now it seems like increasingly we're being marginalized and being told we don't have a place at the table, we don't belong there. It's okay if we send our students there. It's okay if we send our tuition dollars there, but not our ideas. That's a thing of the puritanical past, and we're now enlightened. We don't need that, or we're now woke and we don't need that. So I love that we're willing to engage in truth, and we're willing to engage people and do it in a gentle, loving way.
Awesome. Yeah. So you bring up obviously a big part of that is the way that I think Christianity has kind of stepped away from involvement in the university in the sense of trying to influence what the university teaches and does. How do you see that we have walked away from that and the effects that that has had now on our culture? And how we'll just start even with that. How do you see that we've walked away from that, and how has that changed and reshaped America as we know it right now?
Yeah, I mean, within a decade or two from America, and this is before the United States of America began in 1776. This is in the early 1600s when Europeans first landed here, very early on anyway. They started Harvard University, and its subtitle was Veritas, the Latin word for truth, and they changed it within just a few decades to Truth for Christ in the Church, and it lasted with that motto for 300 years. The same was true of Yale, of Princeton, of Columbia. I've been to almost all of the colonial schools, and I can see just by walking around, doing my own excavation, so to speak, you can see the Bible imprints, the Christian evidence of its past all over their architecture. It's all over their history. We started these universities. And then between 1880 and 1930, Christians abdicated our role and responsibility in high culture and allowed the universities to not secularize in the good sense, that is, in contrast to not sacred, but in contrast to parochial, denominational, something like that. So that would be the contrast. They secularized, though, in a negative sense, in a sense that was subversive to the very roots of not just Christianity, but theism as a whole. And naturalism, scientific naturalism, took over, and it started making a difference in all of the different academic disciplines. If you look at the university as like a hub with various spokes extending from it, where all of the spokes are, and by the way, the contrast I meant was sectarian and secular. So rather than a Presbyterian school or a Congregational school or a Baptist school, they became secular, and that was fine. But in the negative sense, in becoming secular, this hub, which used to be theology, it used to be Christian theism, And all the different academic disciplines were like spokes extending from it, economics and psychology and mathematics, et cetera, so that you have the unity in diversity constituting the university. Now the hub was ripped out and scientific naturalism was put in, and all the departments now started taking on new terms. So politics, which was always part of ethics, became political science, or psychology, which is the study of the soul, now was the Department of Psychological Sciences. Economics became a science. Everything, being a basket weaving major, became a matter of being a scientist, because science was now the be all end all of knowledge. And Christian thought just got pushed out and bracketed and marginalized. And so even though we founded these institutes, we were pushed aside and then had to go retrench. Some saw it as a tactical retrenchment of starting the new breed of Christian schools, the Biola University, the Calvin College, the Wheaton College, and so forth. But we had already done that one time before. Once we evacuated, or once we were kicked out at that point, there was not a lot of opportunity to come back in, and that was the dust was settling in 1930, and it was probably 30 years later that campus ministries now began with Navigators and Campus Crusade and InterVarsity, because they saw the university as the most influential institution of civilization, and we were no longer there.
Right. Yeah. So from here, seeing as though we've already kind of retreated from the universities, and right now still just speaking to the secular schools, not even from the later problem we'll talk about now of how even Christian schools have gone almost to a wayside as well. How do you see, and do you think it's possible for us to get back into that influence and actually kind of, not that it's like we want control, but to have at least our voice heard amongst everything else in that? Because I think a lot of the times on universities, it's almost as if it's not even that people just don't want Christians to have control over the universities and what the curriculum has. They don't even want Christians to have a voice in the universities
Right.
anymore. Do you think it's possible for us to move back to having that voice, and what would that look like?
Yeah, and I think that is what we want to do. We want to reestablish the intellectual plausibility of Christianity. We want to have a seat at the table for the intellectual voice of Christ. We believe in free speech, we believe in free thinking, and we believe in the free market of ideas. May the best ideas, the truest ideas, emerge at the top. And if we have that opportunity to debate, I think we win. But it's that idea that we're not giving the chance for anymore. Right. I think it is, to your second question, possible for us to reclaim the intellectual voice of Christ in the universities, and I do so for a couple of reasons. One of which is just past history. We saw that the universities that were began by Christians, essentially, they were Christ-centered. These places were centers for training of missionaries and pastors. It was true for all of the colonial schools, for example. They got taken over. So when you have a dominant perspective on campus, it's possible that someone else comes in and mission drift, radical mission drift, contradictory kind of mission drift happens. It happened. If it happened once, it can happen again. And in fact, it is happening again right now. But now, instead of being scientific naturalism from one wing of academia, it's coming from the other side of the university, from the humanities and social sciences, and that is a cultural Marxism. It's coming quickly to the ascendancy in the seats of power in academia and taking over, pushing the old scientific naturalists to some respect out. And again, it's happening right before our eyes. So it's happened once before. It's happening again. It can happen yet again, but it has to take concerted effort and focus and a lot of people to understand what's going on to do it.
Definitely, definitely. So an interesting thing in this, in this whole thing regarding universities, is even kind of I would say, finding some new allies as you're talking about this new shift now that the university is taking away from academia to this kind of social, and I would say sexual revolution type thing that's connected to all of this, and how that's now it's not about just like, where before I think it was moving away from the Christian worldview and saying like, well, I think there's another view out there, postmodernism, that's okay, everything's relative. Now it's moving towards my sexual orientation, my sexual desires decide truth over almost anything else. And it's not now even focus on truth in itself. And what we're finding is some of the people that we were before seeing as our, I mean, I wouldn't quite classify it as enemies, but definitely people that were not on our team, as far as something like the new atheist movement that was speaking and saying, I don't think Christianity is true, and so we should get rid of it, are actually looking at this and being like, well, they're just believing that truth is all out the window altogether, and they're starting to kind of come back to us in a sense, teaming up with us. Like in particular, one that I've been watching a lot lately, and a guy that I know you have a relationship with, is Peter Boghossian, where I've been watching his videos lately, and he kind of does the whole spectrum. Like, do you think, one that I watched recently, do you think you should be able to have an abortion up to the third trimester, and kind of have a scale of students can stand on very agree, somewhat agree, disagree, very much disagree. And he just has a discussion with them and asks them questions. And as I watch these videos, Peter Boghossian very much seems to be upholding Christian values, whether it's that topic or it's sexuality or it's trans rights or whatever else. But 5 years ago, maybe even less than that, maybe even 2 or 3 years ago, I would have said Peter Boghossian's one of the guys that on campus we're trying to work against, but now we're working with him. So could you speak into that a little bit?
Yeah, because of the revolution that is taking place right before our eyes, Peter Boghossian and people in his ilk like Richard Dawkins and so forth, they're the ones now being pushed out, and a new king is taking the ascendancy. And so this is what's got Peter reconsidering who his ideological foe and friends really are.
Right.
So an example, I just pulled up a quote from Richard Dawkins. Dawkins said, I think it was in Out of Eden, he said, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Well, we've moved from that dry, amoral universe to something that's now wet and juicy and highly moralistic. It's a whiplash effect, I think, happening, and it comes along with religious fervor, and that is cultural Marxism. Yes, it's rooted in naturalistic thought, but it has a religious zeal to it. And there are blasphemy laws that you dare not violate lest you face the consequences. And these neo-atheists, these scientific materialists, are at the receiving end because they're still there in the universities. The Christians have been kicked out. And so they're now being the recipients of this negative, almost totalitarianism. So someone like a Peter Boghossian would say, and with a lot more empathy today than he would have 5 years ago, but he would concur with the statement from the deist Voltaire that I may disagree with what you say, but I would defend to the death your right to say it.
Yeah.
the idea of free thought. Free thinking used to be the atheist expression that they loved to, absorb and to wear on their sleeves and on their chest. Now, those new atheists with religious zeal are more like Stalin, who was alleged to have said, ideas are more powerful than weapons. We don't allow our enemies to have weapons, so why should we let them have ideas? So the heart of cancel culture is coming from this Marxist, this Stalinistic approach in matters of race, class, sex, gender, ethnicity, religion, you name it. And they're going after classical liberals. They're going after Enlightenment thinkers like Steven Pinker at Harvard or Peter Boghossian at Portland State. So from coast to coast, and even going after Richard Dawkins and taking from him the Humanist of the Year award that they gave him 25 years ago.
Wow.
Because these people now, they have their truth, and you will like it or else. And it's not grounded even science. Science is now considered a Western tool of oppression for some of these people. So you get the people like Peter Boghossian and Dawkins and Pinker and other people who are now going, okay, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I do now see that Christians weren't so bad after all. Maybe, as Dawkins says, they could stick around a little bit longer to function as a bulwark against something worse, if nothing else.
Yeah. Interesting. Dawkins said that, huh?
He said that about Islam originally, because he started seeing things happen. But now he's come around about Christianity, saying something very similar. He's now admitted in his recent book that he calls it the divine spy camera theory. He says, I didn't want to admit this, but I can now see that people are more apt to act morally if they believe that someone is watching them through a spy camera from the sky. In other words, the moral motivational structure of Christianity, even if he thinks it's false, does give a motivation and a sense of responsibility to people more so than without. Yeah. And Peter Boghossian said to Richard Dawkins, I think something like, Richard, if you're not careful, you're going to be doing the lecture circuit around Ratio Christi campuses or evangelical churches and things like that too. Because now Boghossian is being called on by evangelicals, in alliance, because they both see that we may disagree, but at least we believe that truth is objective,
right,
and it's knowable, right, and that we are willing to debate. This right. other new dialogue venue doesn't believe any of that stuff.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with that. It's interesting, like, being on campus, doing campus ministry for the past 6 years or so. I get people that'll ask me every now and then, like, hey, what's the biggest thing that concerns you on the college campuses? And a lot of times I think they're expecting me to say it's the views on LGBTQ, or it's, evolution, or other things of sexuality, or some of these more obvious moral issues that we're going the wrong direction with.
Yeah.
But I always end up telling people my biggest fear is that I think we've lost the ability to dialogue with people that we disagree with. It's one thing to have different views, but so much of it now is this view of either you agree with me or you're wrong and I won't talk to you. Friends that I've had on Facebook that'll throw a post out there, whether it's politically or whatever else, and I put my 2 cents and kind of disagree with them. And rather than dialoguing with me, they unfriend me, which is crazy. Yeah. To me, it's like, if you want to convince people and you truly believe that your view is correct, then when someone disagrees with you, you should be able to reason that out and show them why their reasoning and what they're saying is flawed. But we're not doing that. People are just running from that dialogue when they're challenged at all, instead of trying to actually, like, convince other people. If the Democratic Party is right, and I don't want to make this political because it's not, to me, that's not the central thing. But as an example, if Democratic Party is right and I should be voting that way, you're not going to convince me to start voting democratically by running away from discussion about politics. You're going to have those discussions with me to convince me to move over. Or even racism, where people are saying that it's systematic racism or whatever else. And I'm like, I don't know if I agree with that. And instead of telling me and showing me why I'm wrong not to think that way, they just run away from the dialogue. That's the scariest thing on campuses. That's the scariest thing in our culture altogether, because I think campuses are always kind of the best way to indicate the temperature of culture as a country. And so I totally agree with that. I think that ends up being the scariest thing in the midst of all of this. So another thing I wanted to get to is, I think when it comes to having this awareness that, like, all right, secular schools are a dangerous place in a lot of ways. You know, we talked, I think you maybe already mentioned this already, that you kind of have this phrase of, and maybe repeat it if I don't say it quite as well as you do, that we kind of send students off to universities and pay them to basically unchristianize our students, is a lot of times what ends up happening. And I think parents, for the most part, have awoken to that, or at least a good amount have awoken to that when it comes to sending their kids to secular schools. But when you and I talked a month or two ago, some of what we were talking about is a realization that there's a lot of Christian schools that we should be just as worried about that same problem with. So could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, and just real quick to follow up on what you were saying a moment ago, I appreciated the point about politics and not wanting to make it that. This whole new movement that we're experiencing, this revolution in America that's impacted even the corporate world, it's by something that's invaded our culture from outside of America. It's not Democrat, Republican, left, right. It's what's called the new left, as it was called in the 60s. The Marxist left, who has now come to the ascendancy and is categorically illiberal. They're not liberal in the classical sense. So it's this new movement, and they have taken over certain areas in political parties, and they've ensconced themselves in so many areas in culture where sometimes we view that as still, well, they're on the left side. Well, yeah, they might be on the left side, but they're the new left. They're the radical left. They're an invasive species to America, but it's sufficiently ensconced itself in media, academia, and now even moving into ecclesia. So yeah, my statement is that secularists, and I mean by secular here, not the opposite of sectarian, but subversive to religion, secularists have found a brilliant way to get Christian parents and grandparents to pay for the apostasy of their own children. Yeah. That is, sending them to universities. And so now many want to say, okay, we've got to hunker down and just go into our cloisters and send them off to the Christian schools because they'll be safe that way. Yeah. Number one, they wouldn't be safe because some who are radical in the new left are not going to accept a retreat. They don't accept a white flag, even of surrender. They don't accept apologies. They don't accept forgiveness. Even Richard Dawkins, when he went on the forgiveness apology tour, he was not granted absolution. They don't do that. We're not going to be able to retreat. This is a fight about not just prayer in schools, what's that? Or even free speech. It's free thought itself. And if you think the wrong thought, if you violate blasphemy laws, you don't belong. So this is something serious, and it has begun phase 2 now in higher ed to take over not just the universities of the past that were ours, the Harvard, Yales, and Princetons, for example, but now even the Biola's, Calvin, and Wheaton colleges And those are the premier schools within evangelicalism that were part of our tactical retreat in that one generation a century ago. Now they're starting to see cracks and fissures in their structures, and we have the barbarians are not just at the gates, they're in the citadels. They're in our schools of higher learning, and some have asked me, well, which schools are they at so I can know not to send them? And I would say that would take too long. Maybe ask me where they're not at, and that one's more manageable. So it's becoming pervasive. Again, they're inside the citadel right now. And if parents, if pastors, Christian thinkers, if classical liberal thinkers aren't paying attention to what's happening in our culture, they're not going to have the civilization that we once had. And that's why Peter Boghossian said, look, you need us and we need you. We need to make an alliance here because this is about the whole civilization and it persisting.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, they're in the Christian institutes now.
Yeah. So how would you advise a parent that's trying to figure out a good place? As you're saying, it's hard to list off here the places that they are. It might be easier to list off the places that they aren't. But
Yeah.
even then, like, that's constantly changing. So if I had you give a list right today, that might not be true tomorrow. What
That's
would be
right.
the things that you would be advising a parent of, like, hey, if you're wanting to make sure you don't send your student off to a school that ends up being a problem in that way, here are the things that you should be looking into. What advice would you give in that?
Yeah, first and foremost, they need to look into their own pedagogy, their own responsibility before God to educate their children.
Amen.
And to find the resources available to equip them, not just to survive, but to thrive. Because if they don't do this, then, as the proverb says, train them up in the way they should go, and when they get older, they will get conscripted to work for the other side. I mean, it says they won't depart from it, but that's a generality. But we see what's happening is they go into these secular baptismal fonts and they work for the other side. And now they're going into the Christian schools. And sometimes I think, oh my goodness, at least I know what to expect if I send my kid to Berkeley or to Harvard. But if I send them to one of the Christian schools, that sometimes can be the most deceptive. And so parents need to be resourcing, networking with other people. If they can't do it on their own, network with Ratio Christi or other organizations that focus on critical thinking and truth and so forth. But equip your students. Put the pressure on your pastorate to equip the congregation to make apologetics, a reasonable defense of the faith, part of the standard discipleship of the church. But in terms of looking at these institutes of higher ed, number one, you can look at their faith statements, their doctrinal statements, their statements of belief, and you can find out which ones may have capitulated. What are their views about, miracles, about God, about social justice is the big one now. That term is like a Trojan horse. It may have some good elements in it, but it may have some serious poison in it as well. And if you don't know, we have a booklet at Ratio Christi on that topic, engaging critical theory and the social justice movement. It's free online. But read the university statement of faith, see where they're coming from on that. See if the university has got a DIE statement or DIE officers. Most people haven't heard it with the acronym DIE, D-I-E, but I think that's most appropriate because whatever university hires a DIE officer spells the death of that institution. It's just a matter of time. And it's not diversity, equity, inclusivity, or equity, inclusivity, diversity. It's diversity, inclusivity, equity, and in that order, because we think about what is real, how do I know what is real, how should I then live based on what I know about reality. Those are the three major branches of philosophy. Well, in this new movement of critical theory, whether it's critical queer theory or critical race theory or critical pedagogy or critical legal studies, if it's not critical thinking and it's in any one of the other critical things, it's probably poison. In these things, the view of reality is that humans are in social binaries in different groups of oppressor or oppressed, haves and have-nots, the victim and the victimizer. That's the diversity they're thinking about. They're not thinking diversity of ideas. In fact, when Peter Boghossian and I traveled to Utah universities together, 4 of them, we were called logical fascists. And the fact that we were going to be talking about viewpoint diversity together, they charged us with racism, and they said that's code word for racism. How is that the case? If any view of diversity is advocated at the university, it ought to be viewpoint diversity and the free exchange of ideas. But no more. What they mean by diversity is different body parts and skin pigment, and much more in the Marxist realm as well. Not the 60s feminism, not the 60s civil rights for race and so forth, not even the 60s homosexuality. I just interviewed Joe Dallas, former homosexual pastor of a homosexual gay denomination, last week. It'll be out on our vodcast next week. He said, when I was gay in the 70s, we kind of just wanted to be left alone. We wanted to be treated with dignity and be left alone. He said, now it's an activist movement. Well, that's critical queer theory. That's part of this Marxism. It's the same with race. It's the same with feminism. All of it. It's radicalized. This diversity that they're talking about is poison. The inclusivity then is once you've lined up all the oppressor-oppressed groups, then you include the oppressed groups and you exclude the oppressor groups. That's the view of inclusivity they mean. And then finally, how should I then live based on what I know about reality? And the way you can know which ones are oppressed or oppressor is really only the minoritized community has that inside, secret, esoteric, kind of Gnostic knowledge. But you get to the ethic now, and it's called equity or social justice, and that is to rebalance the power balance and the power imbalance that's been around in race, class, sex, gender, et cetera, by coercion if necessary, even if it means destroying the opposition in all fields of race, class, sex, gender, ethnicity, religion, nationality. You hire a die officer who believes that kind of nonsense. That position next to the president of the university itself is the most strategic and influential position in the university. It's not even the faculty. And when we do statistics in most recent times, even at secular universities, the administrators lean left more than the faculty at these secular universities. Well, the same thing is now happening at Christian universities and sometimes in Christian campus ministries too. The administrators are on major temptation for mission drift. And so I say, look at their doctrinal statement, see if they've hired a die officer or have a die statement or anything like that. And if they do, that's spelling problems. Oh, I'm sorry. That's spelling possible trouble. You can look online at their videos. What guests have they invited in for chapel services? You see this at Biola University. You see it at Grove City College, for example. Jamar Tisby comes in. You get Shanika Walker or various other people at Biola. And you look at their boards also. And if any of their board members that you suspect might have some kind of wokeness, listen to their podcasts, their social media. Follow some of their board members. Follow their president on social media. Start to do the homework to find out what kind of place am I sending my child after I have paid 18 years to raise them with blood, sweat, tears, and love, only to sacrifice them to Moloch.
Yeah, that's some really helpful advice. It's So generally, do you think you're able to kind of just go on websites for the universities and find out if they have an officer or administrator that's kind of in this diversity role? Is that something that's usually pretty easy to access online?
Yeah, you could just get on their university website and you could go into their search engine and just put the term diversity in. As soon as you put it in, you're going to start to see all kinds of interesting stuff come up. And
Right.
that's when the parent needs to contact the university and say, what do you mean by this? And look at some of the other, instances. This is how mission drift, Noah, begins.
Right.
Harvard did not get taken over overnight. It started in 1636, and it wasn't until 1880 that the demise began. That's 250 years, and it kept that statement, its motto, for 300 years. But it happens gradually, but this stuff is happening much quicker now because of social media and because of this virtuous victimology. This new movement thrives on victimhood. It thrives on giving people, on using guilt manipulation by crying oppressed, 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 and playing off the sentiments of people. This is why it's far more powerful than the scientific naturalism that preceded it, which is dry and just all sciency. This stuff's wet and juicy. It's about ethics. It's about compassion. It's about justice. And the Christian, unfortunately, is a better victim, you might say, a better host for this philosophy in some respects than even the secularist. Because the Christian believes in original sin. We believe that people are sinners. We believe that God hates oppression and he loves the downtrodden. And what would Jesus do? And so if the Christian isn't paying attention to this sneaky, subtle, false philosophy coming in, if the Christian doesn't even know how to recognize it, that's a major problem. But it's where we're at today. And the second round that's impacting our seminaries now is not scientific naturalism. It's cultural Marxism, social justice.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting thing. I feel like when I first even got involved, or some of my first taste of apologetics was going to Summit and my experience there. And I remember the readings that we had. And then I thought, I was like, you guys are beating a dead horse because they brought up Marxism and communism. And I was like, guys, this is like, we're past the Cold War. This is over. Marxism is not something that we're going to be dealing with anymore. Boy, was I wrong. Like, that just shows me, like, how well that ministry and a lot of other apologetics ministries at the time had a better pulse on things than I did as a 16-year-old, and it shows that how much like we need those sort of things, where I feel like if I was involved with a Ratio Christi College prep chapter, we probably would have been doing the same sort of things. Now, it wasn't really around when I was at high school, but that sort of thing it's why we need the ministries like us as Ratio Christi on college campuses, preparing students before with our college prep
Yeah.
program, groups like Summit that also do that, Colson Fellows that is aware of how that ends up being a thing. And so seeing that there is a team of ministries around that are aware of that, that's super helpful. Another element to this, and you've definitely like hit on this a bit, that I think we sometimes underestimate, is how much of an influence parents can be having on their kids if they really take the time to speak into their lives. I look at it of, yes, I
Mhm.
went to Summit, but I would say the reason why I didn't necessarily go through any great doubts or questioning of the Christian faith was because I really got some good training and understanding in theology and everything else that my parents grounded me in really well, in a way that a lot of parents don't do with their kids. And realizing that you can have that impact in the midst of how crazy our society is getting regarding all sorts of things. Like I look at it of, I think up until maybe 2 years ago, I looked at it as, if I had kids, I would still send them to a secular school. Now I'm not so sure about that. I think at the very least, through elementary school, I would feel like I want to train my kids up before I send them to a secular school to know that I've grounded them really well in the Christian worldview, and then help them to interact with the secular worldview while they're still in my home. So I guess I kind of get, we've talked a little bit about how do you assess, you're about to send your kid out, they're graduating high school, they're an adult now, how can you advise them to go to a university that's not going to apostatize them essentially? What advice would you give to parents before that stage of, would you send them to a secular school? What sort of things would you be trying to ground in them before? And this is one of those things that I don't think is formulaic. Like, every kid's different, and so you gotta have to assess that yourself. But what advice would you give to parents in that?
Yeah, I mean, at least in the early years, you're thinking, well, our children are supposed to be salt and light. Well, they don't know very much in first grade.
Right.
And, I'll be honest, just last week, one of my second oldest, she's going to be a senior, and she was doing Boiler Kids Camp at Purdue. So she was a camp counselor for a secular camp that, Purdue is putting on for kids around the area. And at the end of the week, during Pride Month, they had LGBT people come in. These were kindergartners.
Gosh.
This is like, and then this is Purdue University, different from Indiana University, in that it's science engineering. They tend to be a little bit more common sense. And Mitch Daniels is there as the president, getting ready to retire. But still, you got radical things happening there. This is for kindergartners, and so we should probably be keeping a closer eye on our kids the younger they are, and each kid is different. So when we started out in a Christian school with our kids, eventually we decided at a certain point to take them out of the Christian school they were in, which in this case was not helping. In fact, it was a better situation, it may sound odd to some, for us to move our oldest out of the Christian school and the environment he was in into the secular school. I'm also not in California. I'm in the Midwest. And so it's not going to be as radical and as risky to do that. In fact, it was a better thing. And it created a sense of ownership with him. Turns out that almost all of his peers that went to Christian school have gone off the deep end. He hasn't. I treat our kids differently. They're different persons. But it is reasonable to think, despite what I just shared, we put them in more of a Christian immersed environment as they're younger, and then let that leash go extend out as they get older to test them, to test the mettle, to get them to be challenged, maybe even at the high school level at a secular school, while you're still at home able to interact with them during this time. Because what happens is, and you and I see this, kids leave the youth group, they leave the Christian church and their home environment, and they go off to the secular university, and two things happen. On Friday night, it's party night on frat row. They want to give into the temptation because everyone's doing it.
Right.
But they have these convictions, and so they don't. But it only takes one semester for professors from psychology to biology to philosophy and economics and communications and history and sociology. That bucket full of conviction now has holes shot out through it, and now there's no reason not to go to the parties that your flesh wants to do on Friday night, and your kid will be home for Christmas, but Christmas will never be the same again, because the secular university has just had its way.
Yeah.
Part of our training of our kids to not just survive, but to thrive, is to, I think, put them in environments where they will be challenged before you do that.
Right.
unless you intend on keeping them in a hazmat suit from, cradle to grave. You've got to get them out there and get some bacteria and viruses, strengthening their immune system at some point. I just am not sure it's the case earlier on. That ought to be where we're a bit more protective, but we ought to be watching along the way. We ought to be teaching them how to read the Bible, not just go read the Bible, but how do you read the Bible? We ought to be teaching them critical thinking. And if you don't know how to do that, there are books on that as well. Right. If you don't know answers to some hot topics, be responsible and reach out to ministries such as ours or others that do engage those things. And maybe we have some resources that we can help in the education of your children.
Right. Awesome. So speaking of children, I know you got to go pick up your daughter. But I want to give you the last word if there's anything else you need to you want to share.
I would just say, look, we are in an ideological war here in our culture. This is a war more broadly on the West, as Douglas Murray calls himself the gay atheist Christian, because he sees what's happening too. And this is all pervasive. It's part of the plan from neo-Marxism to infiltrate the soft tissue of culture, and that is academia, media, and ecclesia, the church as well. And it's happening today. So if parents aren't paying attention to this stuff, you're going to lose your children. You need to be paying attention to this stuff. You need to, because Scripture says to be faithful. What happens in the universities does not stay in the universities. What's happening in our culture is downstream from education, and the apex of education is the university. As goes the university, so goes the culture. As goes the U.S. university right now, so goes the world. So we need to pay attention to our own children, our own church membership, but we need to start thinking missionally about giving to organizations that are actually going after the most strategic, influential institution in civilization, the university.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Corey, thanks a lot. It was great being able to have you on and have you share your wisdom in that. I think parents and other people will find this super helpful, and hopefully it will even help some people get connected with us as Ratio Christi, as a ministry that I don't think there's another ministry that is helping in this area more than we are. And so we're strategic and needed right now.
Agreed.
For sure. So thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Keep up the good work.
Thanks. Will do. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining the show. Next week, I'm fairly certain that I have John Wagner, who's going to be joining up. He is the CEO, I believe, for a ministry called Justice for All that really helps people to know how to talk about abortion in a loving and an understanding manner. That's a topic that is so hard, I think, to be able to have conversations with people in a way, as we talked about with Corey, that they'll actually listen, because so much of it is, if you have a different viewpoint than me, then I'm not going to listen to you. And John and the training that they provide is Justice for All. I don't know of a ministry that does a better job listening and actually getting people to engage with conversation in a way that, even if they might be the type of person that usually would run away from the conversation, they would actually be interested and want to listen to what you have to say. So join us next week, Wednesday at 4, and we'll be engaging with that, and we'll catch you then.